Some say a broken heart never truly heals. It just learns to beat differently. For 20 years, Eli Ward believed that was his truth. At 61, this Montana rancher has lived quietly in Bitter Creek, tending his horses and carrying the memory of his beloved wife Clara like a sacred burden. Everyone in town knows his story, how love came early and left too soon, how some men are meant to love just once. Then Jane Cutter comes home. She's a widow too, returned to care for her dying sister with no plans to stay. But something happens when two people who've known deep love and deeper loss find themselves sharing quiet evenings and gentle conversation. One night under the stars, Eli speaks words he never thought he'd say. "I haven't loved anyone since she died." Then he looks at Jane with eyes that have been closed for 2 decades. Can a heart that's been locked away learn to open again? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the valley floor like a gentle shroud as Eli Ward stepped onto his front porch, coffee mug in hand. At 61, his movements carried the deliberate grace of a man who had learned to measure his days not in hours, but in seasons. The ranch house behind him stood solid against the Montana sky, its weathered logs bearing witness to 43 years of his life, 23 with Clara, 20 without. He walked the familiar path to the barn, his boots finding the worn grooves in the dirt that had been carved by decades of the same morning ritual. The horses nickered softly at his approach, their breath visible in the cool air. Thunder, his black gelding, pushed his nose over the stall door with an expectant rumble. "Morning, old friend," Eli murmured, running a weathered hand along the horse's neck. These conversations with his animals had become more frequent over the years. They listened without judgment, never asked questions he couldn't answer, never expected him to be anyone other than exactly who he was. The town of Bitter Creek spread out below his property like a child's toy set, its handful of streets arranged in tidy rows between the mountains. Population 847, according to the last census, though Eli figured it was closer to 800 now. Young people left for college and careers in Billings or Denver. The old ones passed on. What remained was a core of stubborn souls who found something precious in the harsh beauty of this place. After tending to the horses, Eli made his way to the garden that occupied the south side of his house. Clara's garden, though she'd been gone 20 years come October. He'd kept every flower bed exactly as she'd planned it, following the careful notations in her worn leather journal. The morning glories climbed the trellis she'd built with her own hands. The roses bloomed in the precise shades she'd chosen. Even the small herb section remained unchanged, though he rarely used the basil and thyme that grew there with stubborn persistence. He knelt beside the flower bed, pulling weeds with the same methodical care Clara had taught him during those final months when she'd been too weak to manage the garden herself. "Promise me you'll keep it growing," she'd whispered from her hospital bed, her thin hand grasping his with surprising strength. "Promise me something beautiful will keep growing here." 20 years of promises kept. 20 years of mornings like this one. The sound of an engine pulling into his driveway interrupted his thoughts. Doc Henley's pickup truck rattled to a stop near the porch, and the elderly physician climbed out with the careful movements of a man whose joints protested each Montana winter with increasing vigor. "Eli," Doc called, raising a hand in greeting. "Got a minute?" "Always got time for you, Doc." Eli stood, brushing dirt from his knees. "Coffee's still warm if you want some." They settled on the porch swing that Clara had insisted on hanging there, claiming it would be perfect for watching sunsets. She'd been right, though Eli rarely used it anymore. Some evenings, when the loneliness pressed too heavy, he'd sit here and remember the sound of her laughter mixing with the wind through the cottonwoods. "Jane Cutter's coming home," Doc said without preamble, the way small-town doctors delivered both diagnoses and gossip with the same straightforward honesty. Eli's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. Jane Cutter. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in 30 years, though it had crossed his thoughts more often than he cared to admit. Jane with her auburn hair and green eyes. Jane who'd left Bitter Creek the day after high school graduation with dreams bigger than Montana could hold. That's so. He kept his voice neutral, the way he'd learned to do when conversations threatened to venture into territory he preferred to avoid. Her sister Sarah's taken ill. Cancer. Doc's weathered face creased with concern. Sarah asked me to write to Jane, ask her to come home. Didn't expect she would, truth be told. But she's driving up from Denver tomorrow. Sarah Cutter had never married, had spent her 63 years teaching second grade and tending her small house on Maple Street with the devotion of a woman who found purpose in simple, steady things. The thought of Sarah facing illness alone stirred something uncomfortable in Eli's chest. "Sarah's a good woman," he said finally. "Glad she won't be facing this by herself." Doc studied him with eyes that had seen too much over 50 years of small-town practice. "Jane's a widow now. Lost her husband in a car accident 5 years ago. No children." The information hung between them like smoke from a campfire, present but not quite solid enough to grasp. Eli found himself wondering about the shape of Jane's life, the weight of her losses, whether time had been kinder to her than it had been to him. "That's hard," he said and meant it. "Hard to lose someone you love." "Yes, it is." Doc finished his coffee and stood. "Thought you should know she was coming home. This town's small enough that paths tend to cross." After Doc left, Eli remained on the porch swing, watching the morning light creep across his pastures. Jane Cutter. The girl who'd worked summers at her father's hardware store, who'd helped her mother with the church social every August, who'd caught his eye more than once during their high school years, though he'd been too tongue-tied, and she too focused on her plans to leave. He remembered the last time he'd seen her, at Clara's funeral 20 years ago. Jane had driven up from college in Denver, had stood in the back of the church wearing a black dress that looked too sophisticated for Bitter Creek. She'd approached him after the service, had taken his hands in hers and said something kind about Clara being a beautiful person. He'd been too hollowed out by grief to do more than nod his thanks. The morning passed in its usual rhythm. Eli repaired a section of fence that had come loose during the previous week's storm, checked on his cattle, and made the drive into town for supplies. Bitter Creek's main street stretched 4 blocks between the mountains, lined with businesses that had weathered decades of boom and bust cycles with the stubborn persistence of prairie grass. Martha Sullivan looked up from her inventory when the bell above the general store door announced his arrival. At 72, Martha had been Bitter Creek's unofficial town historian and official gossip dispatcher for as long as anyone could remember. "Morning, Eli," she called, her voice carrying the particular tone that meant news was about to be shared. "Heard Jane Cutter's coming home." So Doc mentioned. Eli collected a basket and began gathering the items on his mental list. Coffee, bread, the few basic groceries that sustained his simple bachelor's existence. "Been gone 30 years, Martha continued, undeterred by his neutral response. "Wonder what she'll make of the old place. Town's changed some since she left." Eli considered this as he selected a loaf of bread from the small bakery section Martha maintained. Bitter Creek had indeed changed, though perhaps not in ways an outsider would immediately notice. The elementary school had closed 5 years ago, not enough children to justify keeping it open. The Grange Hall needed a new roof that no one could quite afford. Young Sheriff Tom Bradley had replaced old Sheriff Morrison, bringing energy and modern ideas to a job that mostly involved settling neighbor disputes and occasionally hauling drunk ranch hands home from the Copper Dollar Saloon. "People changed too," he said finally, approaching the counter with his selections. Martha rang up his purchases with the efficient movements of someone who'd performed the same tasks thousands of times. "Some do," she agreed. "Others stay exactly the same, year after year." The comment carried just enough edge to make Eli look up sharply, but Martha's expression remained pleasantly neutral. Still, he caught her meaning. In a town this small, everyone knew everyone else's story. They knew about his daily routines, his unchanged house, his faithful tending of Clara's garden. They knew he'd never looked twice at another woman, never seemed interested in anything beyond the boundaries of his ranch and his memories. Change isn't always improvement, he said, counting out exact change from his worn leather wallet. No, Martha agreed, but sometimes it's exactly what a person needs. The bell chimed again as Tom Bradley entered, his uniform crisp despite the morning's heat. The sheriff nodded to both of them, his gaze lingering on Eli with what might have been concern. "Eli, glad I ran into you. Had a report about cattle on the county road near your north pasture. Might want to check your fencing up that way." "Appreciate the heads up, Tom." Eli gathered his groceries. "I'll take a look this afternoon." "No rush. Just thought you should know." Tom's smile was friendly but professional. "How are things out your way?" "Quiet. The way I like them." "Good to hear. Sometimes quiet's exactly what a man needs." As Eli drove home, he found himself thinking about the repeated theme of his morning conversations. Change, quiet, what a person needs. As if the entire town had decided he required some form of intervention, some gentle push toward a life less carefully preserved. He'd built his existence around the comfort of routine, around keeping faith with promises made to a dying woman. Every morning brought the same rituals, the same careful maintenance of a life shared with ghosts. Clara's garden, Clara's recipes gathering dust in the kitchen, Clara's clothes still hanging in the closet because some tasks proved too final to complete. The ranch came into view, solid and familiar against the backdrop of mountains that changed color with the light, but never changed their essential shape: home. The place where he'd brought Clara as a bride, where they'd planned to raise children that never came, where she died too young while he held her hand and promised to remember. That evening, as he sat on the porch with his dinner a sandwich eaten more from habit than hunger, Eli found his gaze drawn to the cottonwood tree that dominated his backyard. Clara used to sit beneath its spreading branches with a book, usually in the late afternoon when the chores were done and the light turned golden. She'd claimed it was the most peaceful spot on earth, said she could hear the mountains breathing when she sat there quietly enough. He hadn't sat under that tree since her funeral. The thought of Jane Cutter returning to Bitter Creek stirred something in his chest that felt dangerously close to curiosity. What would she look like now? Would her voice still carry that hint of laughter that had made her popular in high school? Would she find the town smaller than her memories, sadder than her expectations? Would she remember him at all? The questions felt like betrayal, a turning away from the careful solitude he'd constructed. Clara's memory deserved better than his wondering about another woman, even one from his distant past. Clara's garden needed tending, Clara's house required maintenance, Clara's husband had promises to keep. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that Clara would have loved, Eli Ward made himself a promise that felt both necessary and hollow. He would avoid Jane Cutter. He would maintain his routine, his quiet life, his faithful vigil. Some things were too sacred to risk, some grief too precious to abandon. He had no way of knowing that by tomorrow evening, every one of those careful resolutions would lie in ruins around him, scattered like leaves before the wind of change that was already blowing across the Montana plains. Jane Cutter arrived in Bitter Creek on a Tuesday afternoon that felt heavy with approaching storm clouds. She drove a practical sedan with Denver plates, and those who happened to be on Main Street that day noted she took her time getting out of the car, standing beside it for a long moment as if gathering strength for what lay ahead. Eli first saw her at the general store 3 days later, though he recognized her from behind before she turned around. Some things about a person don't change the way they hold their shoulders, the particular tilt of their head when examining something closely. Jane was studying the limited selection of cleaning supplies Martha kept in stock, her auburn hair now threaded with silver, but still catching the afternoon light streaming through the store's front windows. She turned when she heard footsteps, and their eyes met across 27 years and a lifetime of changes. Her face had gained lines around the eyes and mouth, the kind that spoke of laughter and sorrow in equal measure. But her green eyes remained exactly as he remembered, them direct, intelligent, missing nothing. "Eli Ward," she said, and her voice carried that same note of quiet warmth that had made her memorable in high school. "I was wondering if I'd see you." "Jane." He nodded, suddenly conscious of his work clothes, the dirt under his fingernails, the way his own hair had gone completely grey. "Heard you were back. Sorry about Sarah." Her expression shifted, grief settling briefly in the corners of her eyes before she composed herself. "Thank you. The doctors say she has maybe 6 months, maybe less." They stood there in the awkward silence that follows such pronouncements, surrounded by shelves of canned goods and household necessities, while the weight of mortality pressed between them. Martha pretended to be absorbed in her inventory, but Eli could feel her attention like heat from a stove. "If there's anything you need," he found himself saying, "anything I can do to help." "That's kind of you." Jane's smile was brief but genuine. "I'm managing well enough. The house needs some work, but I'm handy with basic repairs." "Your father's training. You remember that? Remember you could fix anything in that hardware store by the time you were 16. Put most grown men to shame." She laughed then, a sound that stirred memories he'd thought safely buried. "I'd forgotten you noticed things like that." What he didn't say was that he'd noticed everything about her during those high school years, the way she'd handled the difficult customers with patient grace, how she'd always had grease under her nails from working on her old truck, the fierce concentration she'd worn when tackling any mechanical problem. What he didn't say was that he'd been half in love with her from a distance, too shy to act on it, too certain she was bound for bigger things than Bitter Creek could offer. "Like I said, if you need anything," he let the offer hang between them. "Actually," Jane hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "Sarah's front porch steps are rotting through. I'm worried about her falling. Do you know anyone who might be able to fix them? I'd pay fair wages." Eli considered this. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to recommend Tom Bradley or one of the younger ranch hands who sometimes did odd jobs in town. Instead, he heard himself saying, "I could take a look, no charge. Sarah taught half this town to read, including me when I was struggling in 2nd grade." Jane's expression softened. "I'd forgotten about that too. She told me once that you were the most determined student she'd ever had. Said you'd stay after school until you got every word right. She was patient with a thick-headed kid. You weren't thick-headed, you were thorough. There's a difference." They completed their shopping in companionable conversation, Jane selecting cleaning supplies and basic groceries, Eli picking up the few items on his own list. When they reached the counter, Martha's eyes sparkled with the particular delight of someone witnessing what might become noteworthy gossip. "Jane, it's so wonderful to have you home," Martha said, ringing up Jane's purchases with unnecessary slowness. "I imagine the house needs quite a bit of work after sitting empty for so long." "Some," Jane agreed carefully. "Nothing I can't handle." "Oh, but you shouldn't have to handle everything yourself. That's what neighbors are for." Martha's gaze shifted meaningfully to Eli. "Don't you think so, Eli?" "Neighbors help neighbors," he said diplomatically. "Always have around here." Outside, Jane paused beside her car, keys in hand. "You really don't need to bother with the steps. I'm sure I can figure something out." "It's not a bother." The words came out more firmly than he'd intended. "I'll stop by tomorrow morning, take a look at what needs doing." She studied his face with an intensity that made him suddenly self-conscious. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded. "All right, thank you, Eli. Sarah will be pleased to know the steps are safe." He watched her drive away, then realized Martha was observing him through the store window with undisguised interest. By evening, he knew, half the town would know that Eli Ward and Jane Cutter had been seen talking together like old friends. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of Montana autumn day that made promises about the winter to come. Eli loaded his truck with tools and lumber, telling himself this was simply a good deed for Sarah's sake, nothing more complicated than neighbor helping neighbor. The Cutter house sat on a quiet side street lined with mature trees, a modest 2-story structure that had housed 3 generations of the family. Jane answered his knock wearing jeans and a flannel shirt that had seen better days, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "You didn't waste any time," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. "Figured I'd get an early start before the weather turns." He followed her through the house, noting the way she'd already begun making it habitable again. Windows opened to air out the mustiness. Dust cloths draped over furniture, boxes of what looked like Sarah's belongings stacked neatly in corners. Sarah sat in the living room in a recliner that had been positioned to catch the morning light, a quilt tucked around her legs despite the warm day. Illness had made her smaller, frailer than Eli remembered, but her smile remained bright when she saw him. Across from her chair, stretched on a large wooden quilting frame that dominated one corner of the room, was the most beautiful piece of needlework Eli had ever seen. It was a wedding ring pattern, worked in cream and gold fabrics that seemed to glow in the morning light. Hundreds of interlocking circles created an endless chain across the surface, each ring pieced with meticulous precision and quilted with stitches so fine they were barely visible. The quilt was perhaps 2/3 complete, with empty spaces where additional rings waited to be added. Needle and thread lay beside the frame, as if Sarah had been working on it when she became too weak to continue. "Eli Ward, you haven't changed a bit," Sarah said, though they both knew it wasn't true. "Morning, Sarah. Heard you've been giving your sister here a hard time. Someone has to keep her busy, or she'll drive herself crazy worrying." Sarah's gaze moved fondly to Jane, who was examining the problematic front steps through the window. "She's always been a worrier, even as a child, wants to fix everything for everyone." Eli found his attention drawn back to the magnificent quilt. "That's beautiful work, Sarah. Wedding ring pattern?" "Double wedding ring," Sarah confirmed, her voice carrying a note of pride. "Started it 5 years ago when I turned 60. My mother always said a woman should have a wedding quilt ready, no matter her age. You never know when love might find you," she used to say. Jane returned from her inspection of the steps, her cheeks flushed from the cool morning air. "Sarah's been working on that quilt off and on for years. The stitching is extraordinary. 22 stitches, to the inch in some places. It's meant for someone special," Sarah said, her eyes moving meaningfully between Jane and Eli. "Someone who understands that the most beautiful things are worth waiting for, worth taking time to create properly." Eli felt heat rise in his neck at the obvious implication. Through the front window, he could see the rotted porch steps that posed such a danger to Sarah's already precarious mobility. "Those steps have been dangerous for months," Sarah continued, following his gaze. "I kept meaning to call someone, but you know how it is. Easy to put off what you can't see getting worse day by day." Eli understood. Some deterioration happened so gradually you stopped noticing it, until suddenly you realized everything was falling apart around you. He spent the morning replacing the rotted boards, aware of Jane moving in and out of the house as she continued her cleaning and organizing. She brought him coffee without being asked, held boards steady when he needed an extra pair of hands, asked intelligent questions about the repair process. Working with her felt surprisingly natural, as if they'd done this many times before. Through the open front door, he could see Sarah working slowly on her quilt, her fingers moving with the careful deliberation of someone for whom each stitch might be precious. The wedding ring seemed to grow before his eyes, the pattern expanding in concentric circles that spoke of patience, hope, and faith in possibilities yet unseen. "You're good at this," Jane said, watching him measure a board with practiced precision. "Had lots of practice keeping an old ranch running. Still, there's a difference between someone who knows how to use tools and someone who understands how things should be built to last." Her approval pleased him more than it should have. When was the last time anyone had noticed his work, complimented his craftsmanship? The ranch hands took his abilities for granted, and he'd been living alone so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone appreciate the care he put into even the smallest tasks. During his lunch break, Sarah insisted he sit beside the quilting frame while Jane prepared sandwiches in the kitchen. Up close, the work was even more impressive, thousands of tiny, perfect stitches holding the layers together, each wedding ring connected to its neighbors in an endless chain of interlocking circles. "This represents something, doesn't it? Eli asked, running his finger along one of the completed rings. Marriage, Sarah said simply. The way two lives become interwoven, how love creates connections that extend beyond just the couple themselves. See how each ring touches others. That's how it should be love, expanding outward, creating community, building something larger than what either person could manage alone. Eli studied the pattern more carefully, seeing now how the individual rings were indeed interconnected, how the removal of any single circle would affect the stability of the whole design. "Will you finish it?" he asked. Sarah's hands stilled on the fabric. "I hope so. I'd like to see it completed, to know it's ready for whoever might need it." Her eyes met his directly, though I suspect it might not have to wait much longer for its purpose to be fulfilled. By afternoon, the steps were solid and safe, the old boards replaced with new lumber that would weather to match the house's character over time. Jane insisted on paying him despite his protests, pressing cash into his hand with a firmness that brooked no argument. "Sarah taught me that honest work deserves honest payment," she said. "Besides, this is what I would have paid anyone else." "Anyone else wouldn't have done as good a job," Sarah called from her position beside the quilt frame. "You built those steps to last another 30 years. As Eli loaded his tools back into the truck, Jane walked him to the vehicle, her expression thoughtful. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for more than just the steps. Sarah's been worried about them for months, but she was too proud to ask for help. You've given her peace of mind. Sarah's good people, always has been." "Yes, she is." Jane hesitated, then seemed to reach a decision. Would you like to stay for lunch? I made soup, and there's more than we can eat." The invitation hung between them, carrying more weight than a simple offer of food. Eli could feel the moment balanced on a knife's edge. He could accept and take the first step towards something he wasn't ready to name, or he could decline and retreat to the safety of his solitary routine. Inside the house, he could see Sarah still working patiently on her wedding quilt, adding one careful stitch at a time to the pattern that would someday celebrate love's triumph over loneliness. "I should get back," he said finally, the words feeling both necessary and hollow. "Got cattle to check on." If Jane was disappointed, she hid it well. "Of course. Thank you again, Eli, for everything." He drove home with the taste of regret sharp on his tongue, knowing he'd been offered something precious and had been too frightened to reach for it. That evening, as he sat on his porch with his solitary dinner, he found himself wondering what Jane's soup had tasted like, what stories Sarah might have shared over lunch, what small intimacies he'd walked away from. The image of Sarah's wedding quilt stayed with him, those interlocking circles of cream and gold, each ring connected to others in an endless chain of possibility. Hundreds of hours of patient work, all invested in the faith that love would eventually claim its prize. The sound of his phone ringing interrupted his brooding. Doc Henley's voice crackled through the old receiver. "Eli, thought you should know, Sarah collapsed this afternoon. Jane called an ambulance. They're at the hospital in Billings now." The words hit him like a physical blow. He thought of Sarah's bright smile that morning, of her patient hands working the wedding quilt, of Jane's gentle care for her sister, of the way mortality could arrive without warning and scatter all your careful plans. How bad? Don't know yet, but Jane's going to need friends around her. She's facing this all alone. After Doc hung up, Eli sat in the gathering darkness, staring out at Clara's garden, where the evening primroses were beginning to open their pale blooms. For 20 years, he'd built his life around the certainty of routine, the comfort of unchanging rituals. But life, it seemed, had other plans. Sarah's unfinished wedding quilt lingered in his mind, those patient circles waiting to be completed, the faith embedded in every careful stitch, the hope that someone, someday, would need what she was creating with such love and devotion. Eli arrived at the hospital in Billings just after midnight, having driven the winding mountain roads with an urgency that surprised him. He found Jane in the waiting room, curled in an uncomfortable plastic chair with a cup of cold coffee balanced on her knees. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, and the relief that crossed her face made something tight in his chest loosen. Eli. Her voice was hoarse from hours of worry. You didn't have to come all this way. Doc called. Figured you shouldn't be sitting here alone. He settled into the chair beside her, noting the way exhaustion had carved deeper lines around her eyes. How is she? Stable, for now. The cancer has spread more than they thought. They want to keep her for observation, maybe start a different treatment. Jane's hands trembled slightly as she set down the coffee cup. I keep thinking I should have come home sooner. Maybe if I'd been here. You can't think like that. The words came out sharper than he'd intended. Trust me on this. That road leads nowhere good. Jane looked at him with sudden understanding. Clara. I spent 2 years after she died thinking about all the things I should have done differently. Should have noticed her symptoms sooner. Should have pushed harder for better doctors. Should have... He stopped, surprised by how easily the old pain rose to the surface. Point is, you can drive yourself crazy with should-haves. They sat in comfortable silence after that, listening to the quiet sounds of the hospital at night, the distant murmur of nurses, the soft beeping of monitors, the whispered conversations of other worried families. Eli found himself studying Jane's profile in the harsh fluorescent light, noting the way she held herself with a dignity that reminded him of Clara during those final hospital stays. Tell me about your husband, he said quietly, not sure why he needed to know, but certain that he did. Jane's smile was soft and sad. David, he was a good man, patient, kind, terrible at fixing things around the house. She glanced at Eli with a hint of humor. Complete opposite of my father in that regard. David was a teacher, loved books and ideas more than anything practical. How long were you married? 15 years. We met in college, both studying literature. He used to joke that we were too bookish for the real world. Her voice caught slightly. He was driving home from a faculty meeting. Black ice, they said. Car went off the road. He died instantly. Eli knew the weight of those words, the way they sat heavy in your chest long after you'd learned to say them without breaking. I'm sorry. It was 5 years ago, but some days it feels like yesterday. Other days it feels like a lifetime. She looked at him directly. I imagine you understand that feeling. I do. A nurse appeared in the doorway, her scrubs decorated with cheerful cartoon cats that seemed incongruous with the seriousness of her expression. Miss Cutter, your sister is awake and asking for you. Jane rose quickly, then hesitated. Could you wait a little longer? I know it's a lot to ask, but... I'll wait, he said, and meant it. Sarah looked smaller in the hospital bed, surrounded by machines and monitors that beeped with mechanical persistence. But her eyes were alert when Jane entered, and she managed a weak smile that reminded Eli of the teacher who had patiently helped him sound out difficult words 40 years ago. There's my troublesome sister, Sarah whispered. I told you not to fuss. And I told you I'd fuss as much as I wanted. Jane took Sarah's hand, careful not to disturb the IV line. How are you feeling? Like I've been hit by a truck, but the doctor says I'm too stubborn to die just yet. Sarah's gaze moved to Eli, standing quietly near the door. Eli Ward, you drove all this way for an old woman? Seemed like the right thing to do. It was. Sarah's voice was getting weaker, but her meaning was clear. Jane needs people around her. She's been alone too long. Over the next 3 days, while Sarah remained in the hospital for tests and treatment adjustments, Eli found himself drawn into a routine he hadn't planned. He would drive to Billings each morning, bringing Jane fresh clothes from the house and homemade meals from Martha's Deli. In the afternoons, when Sarah slept, he and Jane would walk the hospital corridors or sit in the small garden area, talking about everything and nothing. He learned that Jane had worked as a seamstress in Denver, specializing in alterations and custom work. She'd built a small but successful business, finding satisfaction in the precise work of making clothes fit perfectly, of taking something that didn't quite work and making it right. After David died, the work had become a form of meditation, a way to keep her hands busy while her heart slowly healed. I brought my sewing machine with me, she said during one of their garden conversations. Figured I might need something to keep me occupied while Sarah recovers. Old habits. That's practical. Eli thought of his own old habits, the routines that had sustained him through his grief. Work helps. It does, though I'm not sure how much call there is for a seamstress in Bitter Creek these days. More than you might think. Martha's been driving to Billings for alterations for years. Mrs. Peterson too, and half the women in town. Might be they'd appreciate having someone local. Jane looked at him with interest. You really think so? I know so. This town takes care of its own, but it's been missing some services. A good seamstress would be welcomed. That evening, as they sat in Sarah's room watching the older woman sleep peacefully, Jane brought up something that had been weighing on her mind. The doctors want to try a new treatment protocol, but it means Sarah can't be left alone for long periods. I've been thinking maybe I should stay longer than I planned. Maybe through Christmas at least. The words hit Eli with unexpected force. He'd been trying not to think about Jane leaving, about the inevitable day when she would pack up her practical sedan and drive back to her life in Denver. The thought of her staying, of having more time to explore whatever was growing between them, filled him with a hope that felt dangerous. That sounds wise, he said carefully. Sarah would benefit from having you close. It's not just about Sarah. Jane's voice was quiet, but her eyes held his steadily. I've been happier these past few days than I've been in years. There's something about being home, about... She stopped, seeming to choose her words carefully. About having someone to talk to who understands what it's like to lose the person you thought you'd spend your life with. Eli felt the truth of her words resonate in his bones. These past few days, despite the worry about Sarah, had awakened something in him he'd thought permanently buried. The simple pleasure of conversation with someone who shared his experiences, who understood the particular shape of his grief without needing explanations. I'd like you to stay, he said, the admission feeling both terrifying and necessary. Jane smiled, and for the first time since he'd known her, it reached all the way to her eyes. Then I'll stay. When they brought Sarah home 2 days later, she was weaker but determined to maintain her independence. Eli had spent the previous afternoon reinforcing the front porch railing and installing a temporary ramp, anticipating her difficulties with the steps. Jane had watched him work, offering assistance when needed, and he'd found himself remembering what it felt like to have someone appreciate the care he put into even the smallest tasks. You didn't have to do all this, Sarah said, examining the modifications to her house with obvious gratitude. Yes, I did. Eli tested the ramp's stability one more time. Can't have you taking any tumbles. As they settled Sarah in her favorite chair, with her medications organized and the phone within easy reach, Jane walked Eli to his truck. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that reminded him painfully of Clara's favorite time of day. Thank you, Jane said simply, for everything. The hospital visits, the repairs, the way you've... She paused, searching for words. The way you've made this bearable. You don't need to thank me. Yes, I do. She stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of her perfume, something light and floral that made him think of spring mornings. I haven't had someone to depend on in a long time. I'd forgotten what that felt like. Eli found himself studying her face in the golden light, noting the way her green eyes seemed to hold depths he was only beginning to explore. For a moment, standing there beside his truck, with the evening breeze stirring the cottonwoods, he could almost imagine what it might feel like to have someone to come home to again. The thought both thrilled and terrified him. Within a week of Sarah's return home, Jane had transformed the front room of the Cutter house into a workspace that would have made her father proud. Her vintage Singer sewing machine, a 1960s model, with chrome details and the kind of solid construction that lasted generations, occupied the place of honor near the window where the light was best. Bolts of fabric, spools of thread, and the precise tools of her trade arranged themselves around the room with the orderly efficiency of someone who understood the relationship between good organization and quality work. Word traveled fast in Bitter Creek. Martha Sullivan arrived first, carrying an armload of her late husband's shirts that needed taking in. She'd lost weight since his passing and couldn't bear to see his clothes hanging loose on her diminished frame. Mrs. Peterson followed with a dress that had never quite fit right, purchased hopefully from a catalogue, but requiring the kind of adjustments only skilled hands could provide. "I haven't had proper alterations done in years," Martha confessed, watching Jane measure and pin with the methodical precision of someone who had been doing this work for decades. "Been driving all the way to Billings and paying city prices." Jane smiled, her mouth full of pins as she marked a hem. She removed them carefully before speaking. "My father always said there was no excuse for ill-fitting clothes, as long as there were people willing to do the work properly. Your father was a wise man, had the best hardware store this county ever saw." As Jane worked, Sarah held court from her recliner, directing a steady stream of conversation that kept both women entertained. Despite her illness, Sarah's spirits had improved markedly since coming home, and Jane suspected having company and purpose in the house was as healing as any medication. Eli appeared at the end of the week with an unexpected request. He stood in the doorway of Jane's temporary workshop, hat in hand, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "I've got 5 ranch hands," he said without preamble. "Good men but hard on their work clothes. Seams split, knees wear through, that sort of thing. I know it's not fancy work, but if you're looking for steady business—" "Work is work," Jane said, looking up from the dress she was hemming. "Honest labor deserves proper care, whether it's a wedding dress or work clothes." "What I thought you might say." Eli's relief was evident. "I told the men I'd ask. They're willing to pay fair wages for repairs that'll last. Bring them by tomorrow afternoon. I'll take measurements and see what needs doing." The next day brought a parade of ranch hands who shuffled through Jane's workspace with the particular awkwardness of men unaccustomed to being fussed over. They stood patiently while Jane measured and assessed, their weathered faces serious as she explained what could be repaired and what was beyond saving. "You really think you can fix this?" asked Pete Morrison, holding up a work shirt that had seen better decades. "My wife always said it was hopeless." "Your wife probably had better things to do with her time than patchwork shirts," Jane said diplomatically, "but I specialize in hopeless cases." As she worked, Jane found herself thinking about the conversation she'd had with Eli during one of their hospital visits. He'd mentioned that his own clothes often went unmended, that he'd grown accustomed to wearing things until they fell apart rather than bothering with repairs. The admission had stirred something maternal in her, not romantic, exactly, but a desire to care for someone who had spent too many years caring only for himself. When he arrived that evening to check on Sarah and collect his men's measurements, Jane had a surprise waiting for him. "I took the liberty," she said, producing a shirt from her work basket. It was one of Hissa blue chambray work shirt she'd noticed, had a torn seam at the shoulder. "Sarah mentioned you'd left it here last week when you were working on her porch rail." Eli accepted the shirt with an expression Jane couldn't quite read. He examined her repair work with the careful attention he gave to anything well-crafted, running his thumb over the reinforced seam that was now stronger than the original construction. "You didn't need to." "I wanted to." The admission came out more forcefully than she'd intended. "You've done so much for us. It felt good to do something useful in return." "Thank you." His voice was quiet, but there was something in his eyes that made Jane's pulse quicken. "It's been a long time since anyone—" He stopped, seeming to reconsider whatever he'd been about to say. "Since anyone took care of you?" Eli nodded, his gaze holding hers for a moment that stretched longer than casual conversation warranted. Jane felt heat rise in her cheeks and turned back to her sewing to hide it. That evening, after Eli had left and Sarah had settled in for the night, Jane found herself thinking about the weight of solitude she'd recognized in his eyes. She understood it intimately, the way you learn to manage everything yourself, to expect nothing from others, to find comfort in the very independence that sometimes felt like a prison. Her marriage to David had been built on mutual support, on the daily give and take of two people sharing life's burdens and pleasures. After his death, she'd had to learn to be completely self-sufficient, and she'd taken pride in that accomplishment. But Eli's gratitude for something as simple as a mended shirt reminded her of what she'd lost along the way, the particular satisfaction of caring for someone who appreciated the gesture. Over the following days, their routine began to establish itself, with the natural ease of water finding its level. Eli would arrive each afternoon after finishing his ranch work, ostensibly to check on Sarah, but increasingly to linger in conversation with Jane. He would accept coffee if offered, would examine whatever sewing project she was working on with genuine interest, would share stories about his day that gradually revealed the shape of his life. Jane learned that he rose before dawn every morning, that he knew each of his horses by temperament and history, that he read voraciously during the long winter evenings, mostly history and biography, books that transported him to other times and places. She discovered that he had a dry sense of humor that emerged gradually, like sun breaking through clouds, and that his hands were never entirely still, always adjusting something or fixing some small problem he'd noticed. "You're restless," she observed one evening, watching him straighten a picture frame that had been hanging slightly crooked. Occupational hazard. When you spend your life maintaining things, you notice when they're not quite right. Is that what you did for Clara? Maintained things? The question slipped out before Jane could stop it, and she immediately regretted the intrusion. But Eli considered it seriously rather than deflecting. "I tried to," he said finally. "Fixed everything I could fix, kept everything running smooth as possible, as if perfect maintenance could somehow," he shrugged. "Foolish thinking." "Not foolish. Loving." Their eyes met across Sarah's living room, and Jane felt something shift between them, some barrier dissolving like sugar in warm water. This was dangerous territory, this recognition of each other's wounds and the instinctive desire to provide comfort. "Jane," Sarah called from her bedroom, breaking the moment. "Could you help me with my medication?" As Jane rose to tend to her sister, she caught Eli's expression, a mix of relief and disappointment that mirrored her own feelings. They were walking a careful line, she realized, between friendship and something deeper, both of them afraid to acknowledge what was growing between them. Later, as Jane helped Sarah settle for the night, her sister fixed her with the sharp look that had made her an effective teacher for 40 years. "That man cares about you. We're friends, Sarah. We understand each other's situation." Sarah's tone suggested she wasn't buying that explanation. "And what are you going to do about it?" "Nothing. There's nothing to do about it. There's always something to do about it, if you're brave enough." As Jane prepared for bed that night, she found herself thinking about Sarah's words. Bravery had never been her strong suit when it came to matters of the heart. She'd loved David with the comfortable certainty of shared interests and compatible goals, but what she felt stirring toward Eli was different, more uncertain, carrying the weight of their respective losses and the fear of risking her heart again. But as she lay in the narrow bed of her childhood, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around her, Jane admitted to herself what she'd been trying to ignore. For the first time in 5 years, she was no longer simply surviving. She was beginning, tentatively, and against all her careful plans, to hope. October brought the kind of perfect Montana weather that made postcards seem inadequate, days crisp enough to require a light jacket, nights cool enough for a fire, and skies so blue they looked painted. It was during this golden time that Eli finally worked up the courage to invite Jane to see his ranch properly, not just the quick glimpses she'd caught during their hurried trips to and from town. "If you're interested," he said, standing in Sarah's doorway with his hat in his hands, like a nervous teenager. "I know you're busy with work, but Sarah's been feeling stronger, and I thought maybe you'd like to see the place." Jane looked up from the wedding dress. She was Altaringa vintage gown that had belonged to the bride's grandmother and needed extensive work to fit the modern wearer. Her fingers paused on the delicate beadwork as she considered the invitation and what it might mean. "I'd like that," she said simply, and was rewarded by the way Eli's entire posture relaxed. They drove out to his ranch on a Saturday afternoon when Sarah was feeling well enough to insist she needed no supervision. The land unfolded before them in rolling hills studded with cattle, the grass still green despite the advancing season. Jane found herself studying Eli's profile as he pointed out various features: the windbreak he'd planted 15 years ago, the section where he'd expanded the original pasture, the small creek that provided water for the stock. "It's beautiful," she said, meaning it. "You can see why Clara loved it here." Something in Eli's expression shifted at the mention of his wife's name, but not with the pain Jane had expected. Instead, he looked thoughtful, as if considering Clara's presence here from a new angle. She did love it, especially the garden. He pulled the truck to a stop near the house. "Would you like to see it?" Jane had heard about Clara's garden from multiple sources. Martha had mentioned it, Sarah had spoken of its legendary beauty, and Doc Henley had once described it as the finest example of mountain gardening he'd ever seen. But nothing had prepared her for the reality of it. The garden occupied the entire south side of Eli's house, a carefully planned symphony of color and texture that showed evidence of decades of thoughtful cultivation. Even in autumn, with many plants past their prime, Jane could see the artistry in the design, the way taller plants provided backdrop for shorter ones, how the pathways curved to create intimate spaces within the larger whole, how every element had been chosen not just for beauty, but for harmony with its neighbors. "Eli," she breathed, walking slowly along the gravel path he'd maintained with obvious devotion. "This is extraordinary." He followed her, hands deep in his pockets, watching her reaction more than looking at the garden itself. Clara planned it all, drew sketches, researched what would grow best here, ordered plants from catalogs. Took her 3 years to get it established the way she wanted. Jane knelt beside a bed of late-blooming asters, their purple flowers defiant against the approaching winter. "And you've kept it exactly as she designed it?" "Every flower, every path, every plant placement." Eli's voice carried both pride and something else, note that might have been uncertainty. "I follow her journal entries. She wrote down everything: when to plant, when to prune, how to divide the perennials." Jane rose slowly, brushing dirt from her knees, and turned to study Eli's face. "That's a lot of work for one person." "It's worth it. She loved this garden more than anything except—" He stopped, the unfinished sentence hanging between them. "Except you." "Yeah." They stood in the golden afternoon light, surrounded by Clara's vision made manifest, and Jane felt the full weight of what she was seeing. This wasn't just a garden, it was a shrine, a promise kept, a love affair continued beyond death. The beauty of it was undeniable, but so was its function as a barrier, a way of keeping the past alive by refusing to let it change. "Would you like to see where she used to sit?" Eli asked, and there was something vulnerable in his voice that made Jane's heart ache. He led her to the far corner of the garden, where an enormous cottonwood tree spread its branches in a canopy wide enough to shelter a small crowd. Beneath it sat a simple wooden bench, weathered by years of exposure but still solid. The view from this spot encompassed not just the garden but the rolling pastures beyond, the mountains rising in the distance, the vast sky that seemed to go on forever. "She'd sit here in the evenings," Eli said, settling beside Jane on the bench. "Usually with a book, sometimes just watching the light change on the mountains. Said it was the most peaceful place on earth." Jane could understand why. The bench faced west, offering a perfect vantage point for sunsets, and the cottonwood's leaves rustled overhead with a sound like whispered secrets. It was a place designed for contemplation, for the kind of deep stillness that allowed thoughts to settle like sediment in still water. "It is peaceful," she said, and meant it. "I can see why she loved it here." They sat in comfortable silence for a long moment, watching Eli's cattle move slowly across the distant pasture. Jane found herself thinking about the enormous effort required to maintain Clara's vision, intact the hours of weeding and watering, the careful attention to seasonal cycles, the dedication required to honor someone else's dream year after year. "Do you ever think about changing anything?" she asked gently, "adding something new, maybe?" Eli was quiet for so long that Jane wondered if she'd overstepped. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Sometimes. But it feels like I'd be erasing her somehow. This garden is Clara. Every plant she chose, every path she planned. If I change it, what's left of her? Jane felt tears prick her eyes at the raw pain in his voice. She understood his fear after David's death. She'd kept their Denver apartment exactly as it had been for 2 full years, afraid that moving even a book would somehow diminish his memory. But she also understood the prison such preservation could become. Maybe, she said carefully, Clara would want you to add to what she started. Maybe she'd want the garden to grow and change, the way she would have grown and changed if she'd lived. Eli turned to look at her, and Jane saw something shifting in his expression: doubt, hope, fear, all mingling together. I don't know how to think about it any other way, he admitted. For 20 years, keeping things exactly as she left them has been my way of loving her. And it has been loving her. But Jane took a breath, knowing she was venturing into dangerous territory. Clara was a living person who loved growing things. Don't you think she'd want her garden to keep growing too? Before Eli could respond, the moment shattered as his black gelding Thunder approached the fence line, nickering softly for attention. The horse's timing broke the intensity of their conversation, giving both of them a chance to step back from the emotional precipice they'd been approaching. He's begging for treats, Eli said, standing and walking to the fence. Spoiled as a house cat. Jane followed, grateful for the distraction. She watched Eli stroke the horse's neck with gentle familiarity, noting the way Thunder leaned into his touch. There was something deeply attractive about the easy competence Eli displayed with his animals, the quiet confidence of a man comfortable in his own domain. He's beautiful, she said, reaching out tentatively to touch Thunder's nose. Careful, he's a shameless flirt. Give him any encouragement, and he'll follow you around like a lovesick puppy. As if to prove Eli's point, Thunder immediately began nosing at Jane's jacket pockets, searching for hidden treats. She laughed, the sound carrying across the quiet ranch like music. I don't have anything for you, handsome, she told the horse, who continued his optimistic search undeterred. Watching Jane interact with Thunder, Eli felt something loosen in his chest. Clara had been nervous around the horses, had preferred to appreciate them from a safe distance, but Jane showed no fear, seemed to understand instinctively how to approach the animals with the right balance of respect and friendliness. You're good with him, he observed. My father had horses when I was young. I spent most of my childhood in the barn. Jane scratched Thunder behind the ears, earning a contented snuffle. I'd forgotten how much I missed being around them. As the afternoon sun began to slant lower, painting everything in golden light, they made their way back to the house. Eli found himself seeing his home through Jane's eyes, the solid construction that had weathered decades of mountain winters, the wide porch that caught both morning and evening light, the sense of permanence that came from deep roots and careful maintenance. It's a good place, Jane said, as if reading his thoughts. You can feel the love that's gone into it. Clara and we had plans for this place. Thought we'd fill that house with children, grow old watching grandkids play in the garden. Eli's voice was matter-of-fact, but Jane could hear the old pain underneath. Life had different ideas. It usually does. Jane touched his arm briefly, a gesture of comfort that sent warmth shooting through him. But maybe that doesn't mean the plans were wrong, just that they needed adjusting. As they drove back toward town, the mountains casting long shadows across the valley, Jane found herself thinking about the afternoon's revelations. Eli's devotion to Clara's memory was both beautiful and heartbreaking, a testament to love that had endured beyond death. But she also saw how that devotion had become a cage, keeping him trapped in a version of life that could never move forward. The cottonwood tree lingered in her mind, massive, beautiful, but also symbolic of something larger. Like Eli himself, it had deep roots and provided shelter, but it also blocked light from reaching the smaller plants beneath its canopy. Sometimes, Jane thought, even the most beautiful things needed pruning to allow new growth. The week following Jane's visit to the ranch brought an unexpected shift in their carefully established routine. She threw herself into her sewing work with an intensity that bordered on obsession, taking on more projects than she could comfortably handle and staying up late to meet impossible deadlines. When Eli arrived for his usual afternoon visits, he often found her hunched over her machine, surrounded by fabric scraps and empty coffee cups, looking as though she hadn't slept properly in days. "You're pushing too hard," he said one evening, noting the dark circles under her eyes. "I'm fine," Jane replied without looking up from the complex alteration. She was working on a bridesmaid's dress that required complete reconstruction of the bodice. "Just busy." But she wasn't fine, and they both knew it. The visit to his ranch had stirred something in her that she wasn't ready to examine too closely. Seeing Clara's garden, sitting on the bench where his wife had spent her evenings, feeling the weight of 20 years' worth of devoted maintenance, it had forced Jane to confront the reality of what she was walking into. Eli Ward wasn't just a widowed man looking for companionship. He was a man who had built his entire existence around the preservation of his first love's memory. Every flower in that garden, every unchanged detail of his house, every careful ritual of his daily routine served as evidence of a devotion so complete it left no room for anyone else. The realization should have sent her running back to Denver. Instead, it made her want to prove she could carve out her own space in his life, could be useful and necessary in ways that didn't compete with Clara's ghost. Hence the desperate focus on work, the accumulation of clients and projects that would make her indispensable to the community. Sarah watched this self-destructive pattern with the keen observation of someone who had spent 40 years reading the emotional weather of other people. On Thursday evening, as Jane worked past midnight on Mrs. Patterson's winter coat, Sarah finally intervened. "Enough," she said from the doorway, her voice carrying the authority that had once commanded unruly classrooms. "Turn off that machine and come talk to your sister." Jane looked up, blinking owlishly in the lamplight. "I'm almost finished with—" "Now, Jane." Recognizing the tone that brooked no argument, Jane reluctantly set aside her work and followed Sarah into the kitchen. Her sister put the kettle on and settled at the small table with the deliberate movements of someone preparing for a serious conversation. "What's really going on?" Sarah asked, as they waited for the water to boil. "I don't know what you mean. You've been acting like a woman possessed since you visited Eli's ranch. Working yourself to exhaustion, barely eating, avoiding conversations that last longer than 5 minutes. Sarah's gaze was sharp despite her illness. "What happened out there?" Jane found herself unable to meet her sister's eyes. "Nothing happened. I saw his place, met his horse, admired Clara's garden. That's all. And I realized I was being foolish." The words came out in a rush, as if Jane had been holding them back for days. "Sarah, you should see that garden. It's like a monument. Every single plant placed exactly where Clara wanted it, maintained exactly as she designed it. The man has spent 20 years keeping everything exactly as it was the day she died." "I see." Sarah's voice was carefully neutral. "And that frightens you." "Of course it frightens me. How do you compete with a ghost? How do you make room for yourself in a life that's been preserved like a museum exhibit?" The kettle whistled, and Sarah rose to make tea with practiced efficiency. When she returned to the table, her expression was thoughtful. "Maybe you're not supposed to compete. Maybe you're supposed to understand why he's held on so tightly and help him see that he can let go without losing what matters." "That's not my job, Sarah." "Isn't it? When you love someone, isn't helping them heal part of the territory?" Jane felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I never said I loved him." "You didn't have to. It's written all over your face every time he walks through that door." Sarah reached across the table to cover Jane's hand with her own. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" That weekend brought Bitter Creek's annual harvest dance, a tradition that dated back to the town's founding. The community center would be decorated with corn stalks and pumpkins. The local band would play a mix of country standards and classic rock, and nearly everyone in town would show up to eat potluck dishes and dance on floors that had seen 3 generations of celebration. Jane hadn't planned to attend. She'd used her work as an excuse, claiming she was too busy with projects to spare an evening for socializing. But on Friday afternoon, Martha Sullivan arrived with a dress bag and a determined expression. "I brought you something," Martha announced, hanging the bag from Jane's sewing machine. "Don't argue, just try it on." Inside the bag was a dress that took Jane's breath away, a deep blue wool crepe with a simple but elegant cut that would have looked at home in any city but felt appropriate for a small-town dance. It was clearly vintage, probably from the 1950s and in perfect condition. "Martha, I can't." "It was my daughter's," Martha said firmly. "She wore it to her high school formal, then packed it away when she moved to California. It's been sitting in my closet for 20 years, and it deserves to be worn again." She studied Jane with a critical eye. "Should fit you perfectly." The dress did fit perfectly, as if it had been made for Jane's figure. Looking at herself in the mirror, she felt a transformation she hadn't experienced since David's death. Not just attractive, but alive, vital, worth noticing. "You're going to that dance," Martha declared, brooking no argument, "and you're going to have a good time." When Eli arrived that evening for his usual visit, he stopped short at the sight of Jane in the blue dress. She'd swept her hair up in a simple but elegant style, and the color of the dress made her green eyes seem to glow. "You look beautiful," he said, the words coming out rougher than he'd intended. Jane felt heat rise in her cheeks. Martha insisted I needed to get out more. Apparently working constantly isn't healthy. She's right. Eli stood in the doorway, hat in hand, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "Would you, that is, if you're planning to go to the dance, would you like to go together?" The question hung between them, weighted with implications neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Jane found herself thinking about Sarah's words, about love requiring courage, about the risk of leaving this moment unanswered. "Yes," she said simply, "I'd like that." The community center had been transformed for the occasion, strung with white lights and decorated with the season's bounty. Nearly half the town seemed to be in attendance, from teenagers sneaking sips of punch to elderly couples who moved with the practiced ease of 60-year partnerships. Jane and Eli found themselves the subject of considerable attention from the moment they walked through the door together. Conversations paused, heads turned, and more than one knowing look passed between long-time residents. Jane felt suddenly self-conscious, aware that their appearance together would be analyzed and discussed for weeks to come. "Having second thoughts?" Eli asked quietly, noting her tension. "About the dance? No. About giving this town something to talk about, maybe." "Let them talk." His voice carried a note of defiance that surprised both of them. "We're not doing anything wrong." They found seats at a table with Doc Henley and his wife, Martha and her son, who was visiting from Bozeman, and Sheriff Bradley with his new girlfriend. The conversation was easy and inclusive, touching on everything from the weather to local politics to gentle gossip about mutual acquaintances. When the band struck up a slow waltz, Eli surprised Jane by standing and offering his hand. "Dance with me?" She accepted, allowing him to lead her onto the floor where other couples swayed to the familiar melody. Eli danced the way he did everything else, with quiet competence and natural grace. His hand on her waist was warm and steady, his lead confident without being overpowering. "You're full of surprises," Jane said as they moved together to the music. "Clara loved to dance. We used to go to the Grange dances every month when we were first married." His voice held no pain, only fond memory. "I'm probably rusty." "You're not rusty." As the evening progressed, Jane found herself relaxing into the simple pleasure of the occasion. She danced with several other men, Doc Henley, Sheriff Bradley, even Martha's shy son, but always returned to Eli's table, to his steady presence and quiet conversation. It was during the band's break, as they sat sharing a piece of apple pie from the dessert table, that someone approached their table with less than friendly intentions. Frank Morrison, Pete's older brother and a man known for his strong opinions and loose tongue, had clearly been sampling the spiked punch with considerable dedication. "Well, well," Frank said, his words slightly slurred. "Look what we have here." Eli Ward finally decided to step out on Clara's memory. The temperature at their table seemed to drop 10 degrees. Jane felt Eli stiffen beside her, his jaw tightening in a way that suggested controlled anger. "Frank," Doc Henley said warningly, "maybe you should." "Maybe I should speak my mind," Frank interrupted. "Some of us remember Clara Ward, remember what a saint she was. Seems to me her husband might have more respect for her memory than to parade around with the first woman who shows him attention." Jane felt the words hit her like physical blows. She started to rise, ready to leave rather than subject Eli to this kind of public humiliation. But his hand on her arm kept her in place. "That's enough, Frank." Eli's voice was quiet, but carried the kind of steel that made Frank take a step backward. "You're drunk, and you're embarrassing yourself." "I'm not the one embarrassing myself." Frank's gaze shifted to Jane with obvious dislike. "Everyone knows why she really came back. Smelled opportunity, didn't she? Rich widower, lonely old fool." Eli stood so abruptly his chair scraped against the floor. For a moment, Jane thought he might actually strike Frank Morrison, and apparently so did half the people at nearby tables, because conversation stopped and heads turned toward the unfolding drama. Instead, Eli walked around the table until he stood directly in front of Frank, close enough that the other man had to tilt his head back to meet his eyes. "You're going to apologize to the lady," Eli said, his voice carrying clearly across the sudden silence. "And then you're going to walk away before you say something that gets you hurt." Frank opened his mouth to respond, caught sight of Eli's expression, and seemed to think better of it. He mumbled something that might have been an apology in Jane's direction, then stumbled away toward the bar. Eli returned to his seat, his face flushed, but his hands steady. Around them, conversations gradually resumed, but Jane could feel the weight of dozens of curious gazes. "I'm sorry," Eli said quietly. "Frank's an ass when he's been drinking, but he had no right. He's not wrong, though, is he?" Jane's voice was barely above a whisper. "People are talking, wondering what I'm really after, whether I'm taking advantage of your loneliness. Do you care what they think?" The question was simple, but Jane recognized it as a moment of truth. She could retreat now, claim she wasn't ready for the scrutiny that came with being part of Eli's life. Or she could choose to stand beside him, consequences, and gossip be damned. "No," she said, meeting his eyes directly. "I don't care what they think, but I care what you think. I care whether Frank Morrison's ugly words have any effect on how you see me." Eli reached across the table to take her hand, a gesture that was observed and noted by everyone in the room. "I see you exactly as I want to see you. As a woman who's brought light back into my life when I'd forgotten what that felt like." The words hung between them, more intimate than any physical touch. Jane felt her breath catch, understanding that they had just crossed some invisible line from friendship into something far more dangerous and precious. When the band returned from their break and struck up another slow song, Eli stood and offered his hand once again. This time, when Jane accepted, she knew that everyone in the room understood exactly what they were witnessing, not just a dance, but a declaration. Sarah's death came quietly on a Tuesday morning in November, during the brief hour when dawn light filtered through the frost-covered windows of her bedroom. Jane was sitting beside her, had been keeping vigil for 3 days, since Sarah had slipped into the peaceful sleep that everyone knew would be her last. When the time came, Sarah simply stopped breathing, her face serene, her hand still warm in Jane's. The funeral drew nearly the entire population of Bitter Creek, a testament to 4 decades of teaching children and 40 years of quiet community service. Sarah had touched almost every life in town in some way, and the stories shared at her service painted a picture of a woman who had found deep purpose in the small kindnesses that make life bearable. Eli stood beside Jane throughout the service, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of her grief. He spoke briefly during the remembrance time, sharing the story of how Sarah had helped him learn to read when he was struggling in 2nd grade, how her patience and encouragement had shaped his entire approach to learning. "She believed in potential," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed church. "Saw what people could become, not just what they were. That's a rare gift, and this town was blessed to have her for as long as we did." After the burial, as neighbors began the familiar ritual of clearing away flowers and folding chairs, Jane found herself alone in Sarah's house for the first time since her sister's death. The silence felt enormous, pressing against her from all sides. For 30 years, she had lived with the assumption that Sarah would always be there, not close, perhaps, but constant, a fixed point in the constellation of Jane's life. Now she faced the overwhelming task of sorting through a lifetime of accumulated possessions. Sarah had been a keeper of things, letters, photographs, books, small mementos that had seemed important enough to preserve. Every drawer and closet held layers of history that needed to be examined, decisions that only Jane could make. She started with the bedroom dresser, working methodically through drawers filled with carefully folded clothing, jewelry that had belonged to their mother, and the small treasures that accumulate over decades of living. It was in the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of hand-knitted sweaters, that Jane found the manila envelope with her name written on it in Sarah's careful script. Inside were 2 letters, each sealed in its own envelope. One bore Jane's name in Sarah's handwriting. The other, yellowed with age, was addressed to Jane in a different hand that Jane recognized with a shock that made her sit heavily on the edge of the bed. Clara Ward's handwriting, precise, feminine, unmistakably familiar from the garden journal Jane had glimpsed at Eli's ranch. With trembling fingers, Jane opened Sarah's letter first, needing to understand what her sister had preserved and why. My dearest Jane, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're facing the task of clearing out all my earthly accumulations. I'm sorry for that burden, but I hope you'll understand why I kept some things that might seem unnecessary. 20 years ago, Clara Ward came to me with a request that seemed unusual at the time. She was dying, and she knew it, and she was worried about Eli. She'd seen how he was already beginning to withdraw into himself, already starting to build the walls that would eventually isolate him from the possibility of future happiness. Clara asked me to hold on to a letter she'd written, letter meant for you, specifically. She'd noticed, during the times you came home from college, how Eli would watch you when he thought no one was looking. She'd seen something in those glances that gave her hope, some possibility for his future that she wanted to preserve. If Eli ever finds someone to love again, she told me, and if that someone should happen to be Jane Cutter, I want her to know that she has my blessing. She made me promise to give you this letter, if such a day ever came. I never thought I'd have occasion to keep that promise. For 20 years, Eli lived like a man who'd decided love was a one-time gift. But then you came home, and I watched the 2 of you discover each other, and I realized Clara had been wiser than any of us knew. Don't let guilt or the fear of other people's opinions keep you from the happiness you both deserve. Life is shorter than we think, and love is rarer than we hope. When both appear together, it's a gift not to be wasted. All my love, Sarah. Jane read the letter twice before its full meaning settled in her mind. Clara had foreseen this possibility, had actually hoped for it, had taken steps to ensure that her blessing would reach across 20 years to the woman who might one day love her husband. With hands that shook only slightly, Jane opened Clara's letter. Dear Jane, I hope you'll forgive the presumption of this letter, written to someone I hardly know about, circumstances that may never come to pass. But I'm dying, and dying gives you a different perspective on what matters and what doesn't. I've watched you during your visits home from college, seen the way you handle yourself with such grace and intelligence. I've also seen the way my husband looks at you when he thinks no one is paying attention, with admiration and something deeper that he probably doesn't understand himself. Eli is going to be lost when I'm gone. Not just sad lost, he loves with his whole heart, and when that heart breaks, I'm afraid he'll never let it heal. He'll turn our life together into a museum, our love into a monument, and he'll live there among the preserved pieces of what we had instead of building something new. I don't want that for him. Eli Ward deserves to love again, to be loved again, to discover that the heart has room for more than one deep attachment. Love doesn't diminish by being shared, it multiplies. If you're reading this letter, then my husband has found his way to caring about you, and you've found your way to caring about him. I want you to know that this makes me happy in ways I can't fully express. I want you to know that I see no betrayal in it, no dishonor to my memory. What I see is the possibility of Eli learning to live again instead of just existing. What I see is the chance for him to discover that loving me well means being open to loving someone else well too. I have one request. If you'll indulge a dying woman's wishes, don't let him turn you into another version of me. Don't let him love you as a replacement or a substitute. Make him love you for exactly who you are, Jane Cutter, with your own dreams and opinions and ways of seeing the world. And please, if you can find it in your heart to do so, help him understand that keeping my garden exactly as I planned it isn't the only way to honor what we had. I was a living person who loved growing things, and I would want my garden to keep growing too. Maybe you could add something of your own, not to replace what I planted, but to continue the conversation between the past and the future. I'm trusting you with the most precious thing I have, to leave behind Eli's capacity for happiness. Take care of him, Jane. Help him take care of himself. And don't let anyone, including the two of you, convince you that love is a limited resource. With hope and blessing, Clara Ward. Jane sat on Sarah's bed, holding Clara's letter in her lap, and cried for the first time since her sister's death. She cried for Sarah, for Clara, for the 20 years Eli had spent in self-imposed exile from the possibility of happiness. She cried for herself, for the guilt she'd been carrying about, loving a man whose heart had seemed entirely occupied by a ghost. But most of all, she cried with relief. Clara Ward, the woman whose memory had seemed like an insurmountable barrier, had actually built a bridge, had seen this possibility, hoped for it, planned for it, with the same careful attention she'd given to her garden. The sound of a truck in the driveway interrupted her tears. Through the window, she could see Eli climbing out of his pickup, probably coming to check on her, as he had every day since Sarah entered her final decline. He moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who understood grief, who knew that the days immediately following loss required gentle handling. Jane wiped her eyes and went to meet him at the door, Clara's letter still clutched in her hand. When she opened the door, Eli took one look at her face and stepped forward instinctively. "What is it?" he asked, his voice immediately concerned. "What's wrong?" Instead of answering, Jane held out the letter. "Clara wrote this 20 years ago. She asked Sarah to give it to me if we ever found each other." Eli's face went very still. "Clara wrote you a letter. She saw this coming, Eli. She hoped for it. She wanted us to have her blessing." Jane watched a series of emotions cross Eli's face: disbelief, wonder, something that might have been relief. He read Clara's letter twice, his expression growing softer with each word. "She knew," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "She actually knew this might happen, and she—" He looked up at Jane with eyes that held 20 years' worth of accumulated pain beginning to dissolve. "She wanted it to happen. She wanted you to be happy. She wanted you to live, not just exist." Eli folded the letter carefully, as if it were made of spun glass. "I have something to show you. At the ranch, something I found in our bedroom after I read your letter." They drove to Eli's ranch in companionable silence, both of them absorbing the magnitude of what they'd discovered. Clara Ward had not only blessed their relationship from beyond the grave, she had actively orchestrated it, had seen possibilities that neither Jane nor Eli had dared to imagine. At the ranch house, Eli led Jane to the master bedroom she had never entered. It was a large, comfortable room, with windows that looked out over Clara's garden, furnished with pieces that spoke of a shared life built with care and attention. From the top drawer of the dresser beside the bed, Eli withdrew another envelope, this one bearing his name in Clara's familiar handwriting. "I found this yesterday," he said, offering it to Jane. "After I read about it in your letter, I finally looked where she said I should look." Inside was a letter clearly meant as a companion to the one Jane had received, Clara's final words to the husband she was leaving behind. "My beloved Eli, if you're reading this, then Jane Cutter has come into your life in a way that matters, and you've finally found the courage to look for the letter I told you I'd hidden here. I know you, my darling. I know how completely you love, and I know how that completeness will make it hard for you to imagine loving anyone else. But I need you to understand something. The depth of your love for me isn't threatened by the possibility of loving someone else. It's proven by it. You loved me so well that I died knowing I was cherished. Now I need you to love yourself well enough to stay open to the possibility of being cherished again. Jane Cutter is a good woman, strong, independent, capable of appreciating the man you are without needing you to be something different. If she's reading her letter and you're reading yours, then you've both found something worth fighting for. Don't let my memory become a prison, Eli. Let it be a foundation. Build something new on top of what we shared, something that honors the past while embracing the future. And for heaven's sake, let someone help you with that garden. I loved planning it, but I always meant for it to grow and change. Gardens that never change aren't gardens, they're monuments. I want mine to stay alive. Go build a life, my love. Build it with joy and courage, and the knowledge that loving me well means being willing to love well again. Forever yours. Clara. When Eli finished reading, he sank onto the edge of the bed, the letter still in his hands. Jane sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. 20 years, Eli said finally. 20 years I spent thinking I was honoring her memory by staying frozen in place. And all that time, she was hoping you'd find your way forward. Eli turned to look at Jane, and she saw in his eyes a freedom that hadn't been there before the release, that comes from discovering that the prison you've built for yourself was never locked at all. I love you, Jane Cutter, he said, the words simple and direct and carrying the weight of absolute truth. Not as a replacement for Clara, not as a way to fill an empty space, but as exactly who you are. I love your independence and your competence and the way you make me want to be better than I've been. Jane felt tears start again, but this time they were tears of relief, of joy, of the overwhelming gratitude that comes with unexpected grace. I love you too, Eli Ward. I love your steadiness and your kindness and the way you've learned to honor the past without being imprisoned by it. They kissed then, gently at first, and then with growing passion, 20 years of loneliness dissolving in the sweetness of connection, freely given and gratefully received. Outside, the autumn wind stirred the cottonwood leaves, and Clara's garden waited patiently for the spring that would bring new growth to its carefully tended beds. The week following their discovery of Clara's letters brought a transformation to both Eli and Jane that was visible to anyone who knew them well. Eli moved with a lightness that hadn't been seen in 20 years, as if an invisible weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Jane's laughter returned, genuine and frequent, the sound carrying through Sarah's house like music after a long silence. But it was Jane's decision about Sarah's unfinished wedding quilt that truly marked their new beginning. She found the quilt frame in Sarah's back bedroom, a beautiful piece made of cherry wood that had belonged to their grandmother. Stretched across it was Sarah's final projector, wedding ring pattern in shades of cream and gold, with delicate hand-stitching that spoke of countless hours of patient work. Sarah had completed perhaps 2/3 of the quilt before her illness made such detailed work impossible. Jane stood before it on a quiet Thursday afternoon, studying the intricate pattern and thinking about the conversations she and Sarah had shared about dreams deferred, about the courage required to begin again later in life. Sarah had started this quilt when she was 55, claiming it was never too late to prepare for possibilities. I may never need it, Sarah had said, but having it ready feels hopeful somehow. Now, looking at the unfinished wedding rings, Jane understood what her sister had really been doing. This wasn't a quilt for Sarah's imaginary wedding, it was a quilt for love itself, for the possibility that existed in every human heart regardless of age or circumstance. Sarah had been stitching hope into fabric, creating something beautiful that would outlast her own life. When Eli arrived that evening for dinner, their meals together had become a cherished ritual. Jane led him to the back bedroom to see what she'd discovered. Sarah was working on this when she got too sick to continue, Jane explained, running her hand over the completed sections. A wedding ring pattern. She started it 5 years ago and worked on it whenever she had spare time. Eli studied the quilt with appreciation for the craftsmanship involved. It's beautiful work. Your family has talented hands. I've been thinking, Jane hesitated, then pushed forward with the idea that had been growing in her mind all day. I'd like to finish it. Not for Sarah exactly, but for us. For the possibility of us. The words hung between them, weighted with implication. They had declared their love, had freed themselves from the guilt that had constrained their feelings, but they hadn't yet spoken of practical futures, of the logistics of building a life together. Jane, Eli said carefully, are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying I want to stay in Bitter Creek. I want to build a life here, with you, if you'll have me. Jane's voice grew stronger as she spoke, conviction replacing uncertainty. I want to finish Sarah's quilt and hang it in whatever bedroom we eventually share. I want to help you add new plants to Clara's garden. I want to wake up beside you and fall asleep beside you and argue with you about mundane things like what to have for dinner. Eli's smile was slow and devastating. I want all of that too, but Jane, there are things we need to discuss, practical things. My ranch, your business, where we'll live, what the town will say about us moving so fast. The town can mind its own business. Jane interrupted with surprising firmness. As for the practical things, we'll figure them out the way people always have together, one decision at a time. That evening, they began making lists. Jane would sell her Denver apartment and move permanently to Bitter Creek. Her sewing business had already taken root here, and she could expand it gradually, perhaps eventually opening a small shop on Main Street. Eli's ranch could support them both, though they discussed the possibility of diversifying, maybe hosting city people who wanted to experience ranch life, or breeding horses for sale. The question of where to live proved more complex. Jane's feelings about the ranch house were complicated. She loved the Placid's solid construction, its spectacular setting, the sense of permanence it conveyed. But it was also profoundly Clara's house, filled with reminders of Eli's first marriage. I don't want to erase Clara from your home, Jane said as they sat at Eli's kitchen table, sharing coffee and tentative plans. But I also can't live in a shrine. There has to be room for both of us there. Then we'll make room, Eli said simply. Clara's letter said she didn't want her memory to become a prison. Maybe it's time I took her advice. Over the next few days, they began the delicate process of making the ranch house a home for both of them. Some of Clara's things would stay photographs, books, pieces of furniture that held special meaning. Others would find new homes with family members or friends who could appreciate them. Jane would bring her own belongings, would add her own touches, would help create a space that honored the past while embracing the present. The most significant change came when they tackled Clara's closet together. Eli had avoided this task for 20 years, unable to bear the thought of Clara's clothes disappearing from their shared space. But with Jane beside him, the work felt manageable, even healing. This one, Jane said, holding up a blue wool coat that still smelled faintly of Clara's perfume. This should go to Martha. She's always admired Clara's sense of style. And this, Eli said, lifting out a white dress that Jane recognized from photographs. Clara's wedding dress. This should stay in the family, maybe someday. He stopped, looking at Jane with sudden uncertainty. The assumption behind his words was clear, but they hadn't yet spoken explicitly about marriage, about making their commitment legal and permanent. Someday what? Jane asked gently. Someday we might have a daughter or granddaughter who could wear it. Jane felt her breath catch. They had talked about building a life together, but this was the first time either had mentioned the possibility of expanding their family. At 45, Jane had long since resigned herself to childlessness, but medical advances meant it wasn't entirely impossible. Is that something you want? She asked. Children at our age. I want whatever life gives us, Eli said, his voice steady and sure. If that includes children, wonderful. If it's just us, also wonderful. I've learned not to plan too specifically. Life has its own ideas about what we need. That Sunday, they attended church together for the first time since their relationship had become public knowledge. Jane had been dreading the scrutiny, the whispered conversations, the judgment that might come from people who disapproved of their relatively swift courtship. But as they walked into the sanctuary together, she was surprised by the warmth of the reception they received. Doc Henley shook Eli's hand with genuine pleasure. Martha Sullivan embraced Jane like a long-lost daughter. Even Sheriff Bradley, usually reserved in his professional manner, offered congratulations on their obvious happiness. It was after the service, as they lingered on the church steps talking with neighbors, that Jane noticed Frank Morrison approaching. Her stomach tightened, remembering his cruel words at the harvest dance. But the man who stopped before them bore little resemblance to the angry drunk from that October evening. "Eli," Frank said, his hat in his hands and his expression genuinely contrite. "Jane, I owe you both an apology." "Frank," Eli began, but the other man held up a hand. "No, let me say this. I was wrong that night at the dance. Wrong and drunk and speaking from my own bitterness instead of any real concern for Clara's memory." Frank's gaze moved to Jane. "I know you loved your husband the way Eli loved Clara. I know you understand what it means to honor that kind of love." Jane found herself unexpectedly moved by his sincerity. "Thank you, Frank. That means a lot." "Clara Ward was a good woman," Frank continued, "but she was also a wise woman. She wouldn't have wanted Eli to spend the rest of his life alone, and anyone with eyes can see that you two are good for each other." As they drove home from church, Jane reflected on the morning's interactions. The community's acceptance of their relationship felt like a gift she hadn't expected, a blessing that removed one more obstacle from their path forward. "I was wrong about this town," she said, watching the familiar landscape roll past the truck windows. "I thought small places were more judgmental, less accepting of change. Small places know more about real life than city people sometimes give them credit for." Eli replied. "They've all seen loss, seen people struggle to rebuild. Most of them understand that love is rare enough to be celebrated, not criticized." That afternoon, Jane returned to Sarah's quilt with renewed purpose. She had ordered the additional fabric she needed to complete the pattern, and now she began the meditative work of finishing what her sister had started. Each stitch felt like a small act of faith, a tangible commitment to the future she and Eli were building together. As she worked, Jane thought about the conversation they'd had with Pastor Williams after church. The elderly minister had known both Eli and Clara well, had officiated at their wedding 23 years ago. When Eli mentioned they were thinking about marriage, Pastor Williams had smiled with genuine delight. "I'd be honored to marry you both," he'd said. "Clara would have been so pleased to know that Eli found love again, especially with someone she thought so highly of." "Clara knew Jane?" Eli had asked, surprised. "Oh, yes. Clara used to mention her whenever Jane came home to visit. 'That Cutter girl has such good sense,' she'd say. 'I hope she finds her way back here someday.' Seems Clara was more prescient than any of us knew." The conversation had reinforced Jane's growing sense that their love story had been written in part by hands other than their own, that Clara and Sarah had somehow conspired across time and death to bring them together. By evening, Jane had completed another full section of the wedding ring pattern. The quilt was perhaps 3/4 finished now, its cream and gold circles interlocking in an endless chain that seemed to symbolize the continuity of love itself. When Eli arrived for dinner, he found her still bent over the quilt frame, her needle moving with the rhythm of someone who had found deep satisfaction in detailed work. "How much more do you have to do?" he asked, studying the intricate pattern. "Maybe 2 weeks' worth of work, if I keep at it steadily." Jane looked up at him with eyes that sparkled with mischief. "Think we can plan a wedding in 2 weeks?" Eli's answering grin was answer enough. They had spent 20 years learning to live with loss. It was time to learn how to live with love. The Bitter Creek Town Council met on the first Tuesday of December in the basement of the community center, a room that smelled of coffee and old wood and the accumulated weight of decades of civic discussions. Eli Ward had never attended a council meeting in his 23 years as a property owner in the county. He had always preferred to handle his business quietly, to avoid the kind of public attention that came with speaking your mind in front of elected officials and interested neighbors. But Tuesday night found him climbing down the narrow stairs, his boots echoing in the small space, his jaw set with the particular determination of a man who had finally found something worth fighting for. The meeting was nearly half over when Mayor Patricia Henderson called for public comments. Eli rose from his seat in the back row, aware that conversations had already been circulating about his relationship with Jane, aware that some members of the community had concerns they felt needed to be aired publicly. "Eli Ward," Mayor Henderson said with surprise. "This is unusual. What brings you before the council tonight?" "I have something to say about family values," Eli replied, his voice carrying clearly through the small room. "Since I understand that's been a topic of discussion lately." A murmur ran through the assembled crowd. Jane sat in the front row, having arrived earlier to address the council about the possibility of opening a small shop on Main Street. She turned to look at Eli with an expression of concern mixed with admiration. They hadn't discussed this. He was here on his own initiative, prepared to defend their relationship in the most public forum available. "Well then," Mayor Henderson said, settling back in her chair, "the floor is yours." Eli walked to the front of the room, conscious of every eye upon him. In the second row, he could see Frank Morrison sitting with his arms crossed, his expression neutral but attentive. Doc Henley was there, as were Martha Sullivan, Sheriff Bradley, and at least 24 other longtime residents whose opinions carried weight in the community. "Most of you know my story," Eli began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to share. 20 years ago, I lost my wife Clara to cancer. She was 35 years old, full of life and plans and dreams we never got to fulfill together. For 20 years, I've honored her memory by keeping everything exactly as she left, her house, her garden, even my own heart. He paused, looking around the room at faces he had known for decades, people who had respected his grief and his solitude without question. I thought that was what love meant, preservation, keeping faith with the dead by refusing to fully live. I built a monument out of my marriage and lived inside it like a caretaker in a museum. Jane felt tears prick her eyes at the raw honesty in his voice. This was costing him something significant. Eli Ward had never been a man comfortable with public exposure of his private feelings. Then Jane Cutter came home. Eli continued, his gaze finding hers across the room. And for the first time in 20 years, I remembered what it felt like to be fully alive. To look forward instead of just backward. To believe that the future might hold something besides just the careful maintenance of the past. Councilman Robert Hayes, a man in his 70s, who had known Eli since childhood, leaned forward in his chair. "We all respected your grief, Eli. No one questioned your right to mourn your wife as long as you needed to. And I appreciate that respect," Eli replied. "But what I've learned is that there's a difference between honoring the dead and imprisoning yourself with their memory. Clara left me letters I was too afraid to look for until recently, telling me she wanted me to love again. She wanted me to build a new life, not spend the rest of my days maintaining a shrine to the old one." The room was completely silent now, every person focused on Eli's words, with the intensity that comes when someone reveals a truth too personal and powerful to ignore. "Some of you have concerns about Jane and me moving too fast, about whether it's appropriate for people our age to act like young folks in love." Eli's voice grew stronger, more confident. "I understand those concerns, but I disagree with them. Jane and I aren't children. We know what loss looks like, what loneliness costs, what it means to find someone who understands your scars and loves you anyway." Frank Morrison stood up from his seat, and Jane tensed, remembering his earlier hostility, but when he spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than angry. "Eli, I owe you another apology. I spoke out of turn at the dance, said things that came from my own bitterness instead of any real understanding of your situation." "You don't need to." "Yes, I do." Frank's interruption was firm but respectful. "My Sarah died 10 years ago, and I've spent every day since then angry at the world for taking her away. Watching you find happiness again, it forced me to look at my own choices, my own refusal to heal. That made me uncomfortable, so I took it out on you and Jane." Frank sat down, but immediately Martha Sullivan rose to take his place. "I think what Eli's trying to say," Martha began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had observed human nature for 7 decades, "is that love isn't a limited resource. Loving Clara well doesn't mean he can't love Jane well too. And frankly, this community has needed more examples of people choosing happiness instead of just enduring life." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Doc Henley stood next, his medical bag at his feet, his expression thoughtful. "In 50 years of practicing medicine in this town, I've seen what isolation does to people. I've seen how grief can either break you or teach you to value life more deeply." His gaze moved to Eli with obvious respect. "Eli Ward has chosen to value life. That's not something to criticize, it's something to celebrate." One by one, other community members stood to offer their support. Mrs. Peterson spoke about the beautiful alterations Jane had done for her wardrobe. Tom Bradley mentioned how much he'd enjoyed talking with both of them at the harvest dance. Even Pastor Williams, who had arrived late and been sitting quietly in the back, stood to remind everyone that love in all its forms was a gift from God, not something to be questioned or criticized. When the impromptu testimonials finally ended, Mayor Henderson looked around the room with obvious satisfaction. "I think it's clear that this community supports Eli and Jane's relationship," she said formally. "Is there any other business before the council tonight?" Councilwoman Lisa Martinez raised her hand. "Actually, I have a motion to make. I move that we officially welcome Jane Cutter as a permanent resident of Bitter Creek and offer our full support for her business ventures on Main Street." "Seconded," called out Councilman Hayes immediately. The motion passed unanimously. 2 weeks later, on a Saturday morning that dawned clear and cold with the kind of crystalline beauty that made Montana winters seem like gifts rather than endurance tests, Jane Cutter finished the last stitch on Sarah's wedding quilt. She sat back in the chair beside the quilt frame, her neck stiff from hours of concentrated work, and admired the completed pattern spread before her. The wedding rings interlocked in perfect symmetry, each cream and gold circle connecting to its neighbors in an endless chain that seemed to represent the continuity of love itself. The hand-stitching was precise and even, a testament to 2 generations of women who understood that some things were worth doing slowly, with care and attention to detail that would ensure they lasted. Jane ran her fingers over the finished surface, thinking about all the hands that had contributed to this quilter grandmother's hands that had quilted the backing fabric decades ago. Sarah's hands that had planned the pattern and completed 2/3 of the piecing, and now her own hands that had brought the vision to completion. 3 generations of cutter women, each adding their own thread to the larger tapestry. "It's beautiful." Jane turned to find Eli, standing in the doorway, dressed in his best suit and holding a bouquet of flowers that looked suspiciously like they might have come from his greenhouse. The greenhouse where, over the past 2 weeks, he had been nurturing winter blooms that would complement Clara's garden for their wedding ceremony. "The quilt's ready," Jane said, standing and stretching muscles that had grown stiff from the morning's concentrated work. "Are you ready?" Instead of answering directly, Eli crossed the room and took her hands in his. In his left hand, Jane could see the simple gold band that had belonged to his father, a ring that had witnessed 50 years of marriage and would now begin a new chapter of commitment. "I've been ready for this moment since I was too young and stupid to know what I was getting ready for," he said, his voice carrying the particular warmth that had become familiar to her over these past months. Clara used to say that some things were worth waiting for, worth doing right when the time finally comes. Jane felt tears threaten, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. She was a wise woman. She was, and she'd be happy about today. They had chosen to marry in Clara's garden, despite the December cold, because it felt like the right place to begin their new life, together surrounded by the beauty Clara had created, but no longer bound by the limitations of preservation. Over the past weeks, working together in the greenhouse, Jane and Eli had planned additions to the garden that would honor Clara's design while allowing room for growth and change. The ceremony was scheduled for 2 o'clock, when the winter sun would be at its strongest and the mountain air would be crisp but manageable for their guests. Nearly the entire town had been invited, and most had accepted with the enthusiasm that comes when a community has the chance to celebrate genuine happiness. Jane's wedding dress hung in the bedroom closet, not Clara's dress, which they had decided to preserve for some future generation, but a simple cream-colored wool dress that Jane had sewn herself. It was elegant without being fancy, practical without being plain, exactly right for a woman of 45 marrying the love of her unexpected second chance. "I should start getting ready," Jane said, but she made no move to let go of Eli's hands. "In a minute," Eli's expression grew serious. "There's something I want to say first, something I need you to understand before we make this official." Jane felt a flutter of concern. "What is it?" "I need you to know that marrying you doesn't mean I love Clara less. It means I've learned that the heart has room for more than one deep attachment, that loving you is its own thing, separate and complete." The words were so close to what Clara had written in her letter that Jane wondered if Eli had memorized his wife's wisdom and made it his own. "I know that, Eli. I've never wanted you to love Clara less. I've only wanted you to love me too. I do love you, more than I thought I could love anyone again, more than I knew was possible at this stage of life." Eli lifted their joined hands and kissed her knuckles gently. "You've taught me that love isn't a finite resource. It multiplies when it's shared." Jane stood on her tiptoes to kiss him, a brief but tender connection that tasted of promises and new beginnings. "Then let's go share it with the whole town." As Eli left to do his own preparations, Jane looked around Sarah's house one last time. Tomorrow she would begin the process of packing her belongings for the move to the ranch. Some things would go with her sewing machine, her books, the photographs and mementos that told the story of her life before Bitter Creek. Other things would find new homes with people who could appreciate them. But the wedding quilt would come with her, would grace the marriage bed she would soon share with Eli in the room that had once been his and Clara's alone. It would be a symbol of continuity and change, of dreams deferred but not abandoned, of the patient work required to create something beautiful and lasting. Jane touched the quilt one final time, thinking about Sarah's words from months ago. "There's always something to do about it, if you're brave enough." Today, she was brave enough. Today, she was ready to risk her carefully guarded heart on the possibility that love could indeed bloom twice in one lifetime, deeper and more grateful for having learned the price of its absence. In 4 hours, she would become Mrs. Eli Ward, not as a replacement for the woman who had held that title before her, but as the author of the next chapter in a love story that had been written by many hands across many years. The wedding rings on the quilt seemed to shimmer in the afternoon light, endless circles of connection that would soon extend to include two hearts that had learned, finally, to beat in harmony. The wedding took place at precisely 2 o'clock on a December afternoon when the Montana sky arched overhead like a cathedral dome of perfect blue. Snow had dusted the mountains during the night, but Clara's garden remained clear. The pathways swept clean, and the dormant flower beds outlined with evergreen boughs that Eli and Jane had gathered together from the surrounding forest. Nearly 200 people gathered in the space that had once been Clara's private sanctuary and was now transformed into a place of public celebration. Folding chairs arranged in careful rows faced the cottonwood tree where Jane and Eli would exchange vows, its bare branches reaching skyward like benedictory arms. Pastor Williams stood beneath the tree in his best black suit, his weathered hands holding the worn Bible that had officiated at hundreds of weddings and funerals over his 40 years of ministry. At his feet lay a blanket Sarah's finished wedding quilt, spread ceremonially on the ground where the bride and groom would stand to make their promises. Jane walked down the garden path on Doc Henley's arm, having asked the man who had delivered half the babies in Bitter Creek to give her away in the absence of her father. She wore her cream wool dress with a simplicity that spoke of confidence rather than constraint, her silver-threaded hair crowned with a small wreath of winter greenery that Eli had made for her that morning. The dress was her own creation, but the something old came from Clara's jewelry box, a pair of pearl earrings that Eli had given his first wife on their 5th anniversary. Clara's letter had specifically mentioned these earrings, had hoped that someday another woman Eli loved would wear them and make new memories to layer over the old ones. Eli waited beneath the cottonwood tree, wearing his father's suit and his father's wedding ring, carrying in his pocket the vows he had written and rewritten a dozen times before, finally settling on words simple enough to carry the weight of his feelings. When he saw Jane approaching through the garden, she would soon help him tend. His smile was radiant enough to warm the December air. The ceremony itself was brief, but deeply felt. Pastor Williams spoke about the different seasons of love, about hearts that learn to open again after being closed by loss, about the courage required to risk happiness a second time. He read from Ecclesiastes about there being a time for every purpose under heaven, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to keep and a time to let go. When the moment came for vows, Eli spoke first, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "Jane, I promise to love you with the wisdom that comes from having loved before and lost. I promise to honor both our past experiences and our future possibilities. I promise to tend whatever garden we plant together, to help it grow and change and flourish in ways we can't yet imagine." Jane's vows were equally simple and profound. "Eli, I promise to love you not as a replacement for what you've lost, but as a celebration of what you've found. I promise to help you honor Clara's memory while building our own legacy. I promise to be your partner in all the small daily acts that make a marriage strong and lasting." The rings they exchanged were new matching bands of Montana sapphire that caught the winter light like captured sky. But when Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, Eli kissed his bride beneath the same tree where Clara had once read her evening books, and the circle of love expanded rather than replaced what had come before. The reception took place in the community center, transformed for the occasion with white lights and winter flowers. The food came from every kitchen in town, casseroles and salads and desserts that represented the collective goodwill of a community that had watched two of their own find unexpected happiness. Martha Sullivan had made the wedding cake, a simple but elegant creation decorated with sugar flowers that mimicked the design of Clara's garden. When Jane cut the first slice, she found a small surprise inside the layers. Martha had incorporated pressed flowers from Clara's garden, preserved from the previous summer and baked into the sweetness of celebration. "Clara would have wanted to be part of this day somehow," Martha whispered to Jane as they served the cake to their guests. As the afternoon turned to evening, Jane found herself dancing with her new husband to music played by the same local band that had provided entertainment at the Harvest Dance, where they had first appeared together publicly. The same room, the same musicians, but everything transformed by the simple act of choosing love over fear. "Happy?" Eli asked as they swayed together to a waltz that had been popular when they were both young. "Ridiculously happy," Jane replied, her head resting against his shoulder. "Almost embarrassingly happy for people our age. I think people our age are allowed to be embarrassingly happy. We've earned it." Later that evening, in the ranch house that was now officially their shared home, Jane hung Sarah's wedding quilt on the bedroom wall, where both she and Eli could see it every morning when they woke. The cream and gold wedding rings seemed to glow in the lamplight, endless circles of connection that now included not just Jane and Eli, but the whole network of love that had brought them together. Spring would bring new growth to Clara's garden, additions they had planned together, the changes that would honor the original design while allowing room for evolution. Jane's sewing business would expand, perhaps into the small shop on Main Street that the town council had enthusiastically approved. There would be quiet days and difficult days, celebrations and sorrows, all the ordinary miracles that make up a life shared between two people who have learned to appreciate what they have. But tonight, As Jane settled into sleep beside her husband in the bed they would now share, she thought about the journey that had brought her home to Bitter Creek and to love she had never expected to find. Outside their window, the cottonwood tree stood guardian over the garden that would soon bloom again, and somewhere in the winter darkness, the future waited with its arms open wide. Some hearts, Jane thought drowsily as sleep claimed her, are indeed meant to love more than once. Some dreams are worth the patience required to see them fulfilled. And sometimes, when you're brave enough to risk everything on the possibility of joy, life rewards that courage with a happiness deeper and more grateful than anything you dared to imagine. The last thing she heard before sleep took her completely was the steady rhythm of Eli's breathing beside her, and the whisper of wind through the cottonwood leaves her sound like blessing, like welcome, like the promise of spring.